Welcome to Dewsbury TV. These are the election debates for 2015 for the Dewsbury candidates.
And what we've decided to do this time is let the candidates interview each other. It gives them equal chance then to sell themselves to the electorate. And at the end of that, we'll allow themselves 30 seconds to give you a direct message to see whether they can get your vote. We did invite all 6 major parties to be interviewed in this fashion. But after agreeing initially, Paula Sherriff from the Labour Party and Adrian Cruden from the Liberal Democrats gave backward shortly before filming.
And the last interview we have is Yorkshire First interviewing the Green Party.
And that's Richard Carter and Adrian Cruden.
Hello. Could you just tell us a little bit about the Green Party and yourself and why you think people of Dewsbury should be voting Green?
Yeah, Richard, my name's Adrian Cruden and I've lived in Thornhill in Dewsbury for the last 15 years now. In terms of the party and the Green Party, we've got some strong local roots here. At the local elections last year we came third. We got about 14% of the vote across the constituency, and we have a couple of councillors in the area. As well as we run Kirkburton Parish Council with an absolute outright control. In terms of where we stand, we are very much about seeking a fairer, more equal society. And we come at that from the perspective that social justice is important, along with our environmental concerns, because we're very worried about global warming and the climate change. And we feel that in terms of the way that the Earth's resources are used, we need to use them more carefully than we have been. And the only logical way to do that is to also use them more fairly. Because when we look at both the United Kingdom and the world as a whole, there is such a great deal of inequality, and it's actually got much worse over the last 10 to 20 years. According to Oxfam, in the next few weeks, we will finally reach the point where the top 1% on the planet own more than half of the resources. And that's actually replicated in the United Kingdom, where it's almost the same share of wealth as in the hands of the same tiny number of people, which means that everybody else is scrambling to make do with what's left over for the rest of us. So if you look at towns like Dewsbury, which have become desperately depressed, our town centre is defined by pound shops, charity shops and empty shops. You know, what was once a bustling local community has effectively died economically on its feet. And that is very much because large corporations, national chains and so on have sucked all that up. And as I'm sure you know, their interests aren't in Dewsbury or Yorkshire. They're in boardrooms which are sometimes on the other side of the world. So it might sound that some of that is very distant, but it's actually very relevant to the day-to-day lives of people here in Dewsbury and Murfield and the other parts of the constituency.
Yeah. I tend to agree with much of what you said there, but how would you actually address some of those issues? So let me give you an example. Yorkshire generates 16% of this country's electric capacity. We've got fantastic background in wind generation. We've had examples of Siemens coming to this area, etc. What Yorkshire First think is that we need to use this as an example of how we can actually help and move towards a non-carbon future. How would you address some of these kind of issues?
Well, what we want to see is perhaps a little bit like yourselves, is a lot more local decision making. And from that perspective, a lot more investment in local industries. So, for example, Siemens coming to the East Coast is brilliant in one sense because it will generate a lot of renewable, clean energy. But the other side of it is we're actually having to look abroad to get people to come and do that. And I think that's one of the tragedies, because this government, the current Conservative government, has actually removed a lot of the investment from renewable energy. So as a result of that, we have lost our domestic capacity. We have nobody in this country who can make wind generators, and even the solar energy side of things is increasing. We're having to look abroad to source that. Britain is actually starting to lose out in the renewable revolution. If you look at countries like Germany, Denmark, they are way ahead of us in terms of being able to use clean energy. Even China, which is often castigated as being the dirty country of the world because it's opening so many coal energy stations. China itself is now turning to renewables, and almost 30% of Chinese energy is generated by clean renewable technology. China is investing more in renewable energy now than the rest of the world put together. And the risk for us with our obsession about, or with the current government's obsession with things like fracking, which they're talking about potentially happening in parts of the Dewsbury constituency, is that we will continue to use dirty fuels, which may, in case of fracking, poison the local environment and cause ill health to people. But it will also, in the longer term, leave us way behind at a big disadvantage when all the skills and the capacity for new style energy and clean energy are actually in other countries. So we want to see the British government investing in that. But also, just to go back a wee bit to what you were talking about earlier about how we address some of the inequalities, we really want to crack down on the rich, because there are some really super rich people in this country, as well as big corporations that are not paying their taxes. And we want to levy higher taxes on them, but we also want to clamp down on all the tax evasion and tax avoidance that's going on. And we believe
Doesn't
that
everybody always say crack down on it? I mean, I've heard this for the last 20 years. You know, they keep cracking down on it, but when are they actually going to crack it?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because we had George Osborne just a few weeks ago at the budget say that they were going to crack down and they were going to get as much as £5 billion back for the Treasury. But the actual real scandal, Richard, is that if you look at a lot of estimates, the actual tax avoidance is around £120 billion a year from the UK Treasury. We would like to see a real task force set up to really address that and really clamp down on people who are avoiding things. At the moment, the government spends a lot of time prosecuting benefits fraud, which not apologise. I'm not advocating benefits fraud, but in actual fact, what is actually lost out of benefits is around something like £2 billion a year. Compare that to the £120 billion tax fraud that we're dealing with, and they've got their resources mismatched. They should be going for the rich, and that way you would then start to redistribute some of the wealth, and you'd also be able to pay more effectively for public services, and actually probably have some left over to start tackling the deficit that they keep talking to us about.
But if you bash the rich, why is anybody going to want to set up their own business? Why wouldn't it just discourage business?
When we're talking about the rich, I'm talking about the 1,000 corporations that run the world economy. About 95% of business is in the hands of big business. And when we say big business, we mean multinationals, which are way above even Europe and so on. They exist right round the planet. If you unpick a lot of the labels that you see in the high street, you might think it's a British chain or even a European chain. In actual fact, it's a global chain. It'll be owned by all sorts of other companies which you've never heard of, and ultimately by some people who could be anywhere on the planet. They certainly will not have our interests here at heart. So that's the people we're talking about. We're not talking about local small businesses. We actually believe in a tax regime that supports local small businesses so that they would pay less corporation tax than big businesses. We'd like to see something like a Tesco tax, so that, for example, local councils could actually levy higher taxes on out-of-town shopping centres, which they could then use to subsidise costs in towns like Dewsbury for local businesses, so that you could actually have an actual bias towards supporting and fostering local business, cooperatives, small-scale things like that.
So, I mean, ultimately, from your perspective, it's a similar kind of discussion when we're talking about the rich there. It's almost corporations and normal everyday businesses.
Yeah. Not talking about local people, if somebody wants to set up in business. We're very much in favour of that, because, again, the more local businesses you have, especially local manufacturing, which has died in this country, that's so key from the point of view of tackling what I was saying earlier about things like global warming, because there's so many goods which are transported around the planet. Again, we're talking about China. So much of our manufacturing, which used to be done in this country, is now done in China, and then they ship these goods here. And it's a terrible, terrible damage to the environment, as well as removing wealth and removing jobs from this country. So we very much favour a tax regime and an economic policy which rebalances that and has a really big focus on local communities and local enterprise.
Okay. With regard to these skills shortages, we keep being told that we need more skilled people into this country. Now, to us, that says that we are failing as a country because we are not producing the people with the right skills, which means then employers will always find them somehow. How would you look to address this kind of issue?
Well, I think a lot of it is again about investing in domestic skills training, whether that's apprenticeships or vocational qualifications or in our schools, you know, and getting people. I mean, we very much believe in education for life. So one of the things which again we've costed out in the manifesto is having education which starts preschool. We don't not actually start compulsory education until the age of 7, but we'd have it available from the age of 3 on a voluntary basis. But that you actually should also fund that on into adulthood, and that learning should be for life, and the government needs to invest in that. It shouldn't just be on random costs to employers. Not that we're against that as well, but that should be additional to a core education system which is for all stages of life. And again, from that perspective, that would give us the skills which, for example, I think in a previous discussion they were talking about the lack of nurses or some of the problems that nurses have in the UK. We don't invest enough in our medical training. So that's what, again, the specific policy for us is to invest a lot more in training more doctors and nurses so that we're employing our own people, but actually also we're not taking people whose skills are needed, you know, in other countries. We see the immigration issue as being something about developing what we're doing and changing what we do in this country, rather than worrying about putting up barriers to people from other countries coming to work here, or for us going abroad and living and working there, which a lot of British people do now.
Okay, just to summarise then, give the top 3 reasons why people should vote Green for you in this next election.
Because we're competitive in this constituency, because we can make a big difference to how the country works, and because a lot of that is about bringing power back to people and communities in Dewsbury, Murfield, Kirkburton and Danbydale.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done.
Hello, my name's Adrian Cruden. I'm standing for the Green Party. I've lived in this area for the last 15 years and in Yorkshire for most of my life, majority of my life. I hope that you'll consider supporting the Green Party because we stand for a fairer, more equal society, one where we use resources more carefully but share them more fairly as well. And I think that's very relevant to people in Dewsbury.